Welcome to Transition of the American West. This is Melinda Cole Klein. In the last 2 decades of the 19th century, the West grew in population. By the 1890s, the population of the West was more urbanized than it had been in the past. By the early 1900s, about 40% of Americans lived in cities. The incoming people to the West adopted new ideals in reaction to what they found, creating unique communities and forging the possibility of joining expansionist moods promised in the 1840s with Manifest Destiny. In making use of the natural resources of the West, gaps between certain regions of the United States were narrower, with the coming of the Transcontinental Railroad by 1869. By the turn of the century, the uniqueness of a Wild West was somehow lost in a national memory in which the West was made. The West changed as capitalism and industry made their way across the Plain States in a fashion that was often violent, lawless, and corrupt. The West would be remembered in a romantic light by artists, writers, and by filmmakers by generations to come. The Western fur trade in beaver and buffalo was an extension of a much older pattern of trade that began in southern Canada and New England. The killing of wild animals for their furs is seen by white settlers of the past and Native Americans in 2 distinct views. White trappers saw their commercial value. The goal was to trap and kill as many as possible with no regard for the species, because the Christian Bible taught Europeans the world's resources had been put on earth by God for their use. Native American tribes hunted in seasons to suit their needs for living, with respect given not to overhunt or disrupt the pattern of their existence. For Native Americans, animal products meant much to them in their use. To white trappers, their value was in exchange. Under such conditions, cattle, horses, and sheep emerged as animals of enterprise, grown by whites to be sold as a commodity and easily stolen by Native Americans to be used or given as gifts. For the West to be suitable for white settlers, the wholesale slaughter of the buffalo was inevitable. With their absence, this opened up the plains for cattle and sheep ranchers that would more effectively provide food, clothing, and energy for humans while turning profits. Americans have not always been eaters of beef, but by the end of the 19th century, there was a great demand for it. If the American diet had stuck to chicken, pork, or seafood, the making of the American West might have turned out quite differently. After the Civil War, American tastes preferred beef and wanted more of it. Beef represented a higher status food as it does today. The financially challenged eat hamburger, while the middle class and elite eat steak. This symbolism of wealth and the rugged American character run deep. The open ranges of the Plain States represented a commercial venture to benefit a growing and hungry nation. Eastern consumers hungry for beef did not want the range-fed grassland beef driven to market by cowboys on cattle drives, as it tended to be tough and stringy. Elite consumers desired the corn-fed, fatter beef, found in Midwestern states. In the promotion of stock raising in the West, the quality of beef seemed a major obstacle as well as the price. For beef to be cheap, it needed to be mass-produced. This could not happen until it could be preserved. Gustav Swift created a fleet of refrigerated railroad cars by 1882, and the marketing of refrigerated beef to Chicago and then onward to New York City was then possible. By the 1880s, the Chicago packing houses dominated the American marketplace. Chicago became the meat and beef capital of America. Packing houses still rang our collective memories. Swift, Armour, Morris, and Hammond. These names quickly monopolized the market with their industrial slaughterhouses. By the early 20th century, Chicago packing houses supplied the nation with approximately 82% of its beef. I'd like you to think of the following points. Number 1, American Sunday dinners seem to become a standard fare of roast beef, potatoes, peas, and apple pie. For Anglo-Americans, Irish Americans, and Germans, beef represented the good life. Number 2, as pigs lost their pioneering role in the making of the West, it was the processing of pigs in Chicago slaughterhouses that lay the foundation for the processing of cattle into beef. And number 3, meatpacking factories became year-round operations, and with the coming of the railroad and refrigeration, cattle as an industry, this story was now complete. When thinking about the American settler who took part in the making of the West, this family story is at the core of America's history. Many kinds of families came out west, while the West was not an empty space. Western migrants came for a variety of reasons, and to pursue a range of livelihoods from vigilante to saloon keeper to merchant trader, cattleman, prostitute to farmer. This diversity of the people migrating west had determined its eventual settlement patterns. Frontier families and their interaction with each other made life in the West filled with conflict, commercialism, and conquest. It was the family cultures of the westward migrating European Americans that would win the making of the West. This population would make up the greatest of the changes that would come. And 3 family styles who settled the West are as follows. The first one is patrimonial. The second one is proletarian. And the third one is entrepreneurial. American families are heirs to what has been termed the Western European family system. Central to the survival of the traditional family was the system of patrimony. Typically, it depended on factors associated with private property, accumulated over generations as a source of wealth. This was a common family type. For it to continue, the household would have to make enough money to not only support the current family, but would continue through inheritance to children and grandchildren. It was through this family type a young adult gained enough knowledge and skill to pursue independence. For example, a son grows and learns to be a farmer like his father. Father dies and leaves him the farm. In another example, A second son either moves west to pursue farming or another line of work after sufficient schooling. If the first son or other inheritors dies, he would be the next to inherit the property wealth left to a relative or other sibling. The proletarian is a wage labor earner. This person, whether urban or rural, lacks access to land ownership or has not pursued training to obtain skills to work a farm or trade. He moves from place to place. If left unchanged, he is likely to spend his entire adult life as an unskilled worker. In this type of household, it becomes necessary for generations of family members to live together in efforts to pool their monetary resources to survive. They rarely become property owners and remain at the subsistence level. In essence, the proletarian family style, these individuals live from paycheck to paycheck. At the top and middle segments of the American economic spectrum is the entrepreneurial family. This family style is less concerned with waiting or expecting to receive monies or inherited land or other forms of wealth from relatives. Instead, this family type survives because the head of household has pursued an educational path, either formal or informal, to become one of these three types of individuals. The first category. This is a trained craftsman such as a printer, shopkeeper, accountant, bookkeeper, farmer, whaler, mariner, seagoing trader, etc. The second category. This is a professional who would be educated at college, such as a doctor, lawyer, teacher, judges and magistrates, or politicians. And the third category. Become skilled in such a way that these individuals can make a living and accumulate some wealth. A variety of entrepreneurial enterprises can be established as the result of informal training and personal desire. Intelligent or possession of excellent eye-to-hand coordination. These 19th century and early 20th century skills were often used for good or evil. A few examples include prostitution, local justice, including fields such as for lawmen, local sheriffs, and policemen, along with military enlistment, female skilled trades, blacksmithing, tailoring, that could have been learned by women informally. Traditionally, boys were apprenticed for trade occupations and not girls, but this has changed over time. In this time, men or women good with weaponry could be hired guns, or as the alternative, men or women could be hired as vigilantes. These three family types, whether black, white, or immigrant, would earn a living in the West or would perish. Each family type had a keen eye on the economy, knew how they could plan and would fit into it, and were resilient in their goals to succeed. They adapted to the ever-changing economic climate as it became necessary, such as to go back to school to earn another degree, take in a partner in one's company, or make a new investment, and other choices such as the purchase of low-cost land. Typically in these family types, the father worked middle management occupations, such as warehouse import-export account manager, or was an educated professional working outside of the family home. For entrepreneurs and other family types, the wife was expected to cultivate the ideal of domestic bliss, tranquility of life, in a home environment that was tastefully decorated and exhibited the family's material wealth, represented in their status in the community. Two prominent subcultures of the American West were the Yankees and the Hoosiers. Transplanted Yankees arrived and settled western regions from the New England states, typically of British American colonial stock or recent immigrants from Northern Europe, having lived a generation or so in New England. Hoosiers, on the other hand, came from a later colonial population from the early Republican years, in and around or within the Indiana area. Hoosiers were typically heavily armed and possessed short tempers. Like Yankees, kin networks and alliances were important features. Hoosier frontier culture was different in form and practice from the New Englanders. Life in the upper Northeast often meant long winters and a short growing season. Time was always short, not enough time in the day to complete tasks needing done. In addition, idleness and time wasted was considered a sin. Thus, New Englanders as a culture became a most industrious frontier population. Some of their agricultural pursuits included the growing of hay, fruit orchard tending, dairy-oriented activities along with cheese production, while cultivating large vegetable gardens. Yankees made excellent entrepreneurs, and poverty among this culture was quite low across time as compared with other Americans. They were often literate and avid churchgoers as a group. Hard work resulted in economic profits. Yankees enjoyed meals of roasted chicken, cheese and berries, bacon, apple tarts, vegetable dishes, along with baked breads and pies. On the other hand, Hoosiers, because of their frontier settlements, lacked religious unity and did not mandate the control of moral behavior like in New England. They lacked any sense that leisure was sinful. Hoosiers gained a reputation for easy lifestyles, gained from little effort. Poverty, inadequate diets, and disease frequented frontier families of this culture. As whiskey production was a frontier commodity that supplemented farming, the excessive drinking of spirits was common. For Hoosiers, their meal would be a simple affair consisting of pan-fried cornbread and a stew-like concoction. Other groups pushing out west after arriving in America as recent immigrants to New York City were Swedish settlers. Swedes migrated to Minnesota, preferring to plant barley, wheat, and oats. They were entrepreneurial farmers to which dairy farming was included. Russian and German settlers migrated into Nebraska, planting grains and rearing some farm animals. From the 1850s to the 1920s, the life in the western United States was heavy on violence. A philosophy emerged in the West to which settlers quickly adapted and incorporated into their lives. A set of beliefs Westerners decided to resort at times to violence when necessary, and these included the 5 following points. Number 1, homestead ethic. Number 2, justifiable dueling. Number 3, Western trappings. Number 4, livelihood rights. And number 5, use of vigilantes. In regards to property issues stood the homestead ethic. This was the right to stand one's ground and entitled to use deadly force if necessary. By confronting bandits and Indians when threatened, when there was no other way out, the frontiersman claimed the right to kill to protect his or her own property and kin. The following 2 points are tied to honor and reputation issues. The first one is justifiable dueling. Personal disagreements such as slander and insults could be resolved using dueling. The one left standing was considered right and truthful. Secondly, there were Western trappings. These were symbols of authority and power. Settlers wore on a daily basis firearms or had a rifle sleeved into their saddles as a part of the riding habit. Settlers of the West are, historically, the most heavily armed populations in the world. A man or woman could use a gun well was praised for their willingness to put their life on the line. The next 2 philosophies are tied to economic and legal shortcomings. First, we have livelihood rights. Property owners condoned violence if their livelihoods were perceived as threatened. Rich or up-and-coming, these men on the make were ready to resort to violence, usually by hiring someone to do the dirty work, to defend their land or access to water rights. And then secondly, there was the use of vigilantes to settle differences when there seemed to be no other solution. Settlers or towns took the law into their own hands to either set a wrong right, we call this frontier justice, or to fund a paid killer to eliminate a threat. And there was a healthy market for hired killers, especially by wealthy men that wanted so-and-so politician out of the way, for example. In the famed boom towns of Abilene, Texas and Dodge City, Kansas, when store owners formed an alliance to keep the peace in their small towns, curbing disorder and violence when cowboys herding cattle came into town, were known to employ skilled gunfighters like Wyatt Earp to keep the cowboys in line, whether arresting drunken and destructive cowboys or to kill them. By the eve of World War I, the West produced the majority of the nation's copper, gold, and silver. Copper was so vital to the creating of electrical, telegraph, and in time telephone industries that after the 1880s mining copper became a very lucrative venture. Copper in the West first appeared in Montana and then in Arizona by 1910. In time it appeared in Utah, Nevada, and New Mexico. But mining copper was costly. It required a significant amount of capital to mine, smelt, and market. In time, 3 large corporations emerged that would pursue copper mining. They included the Anaconda in Montana, backed by Rockefeller money, Kennecott in Utah and Alaska, and Phelps Dodge in Arizona. By 1940, these 3 corporations dominated the U.S. copper market, and their output from the West was 80%. By 1901, it was understood by many that additional sources of fuel needed to be found and made available. Coal was not a long-term solution. Oil refined into gasoline and lubricated oils became the future. Oil was tapped in Texas and California, becoming a booming industry by the 1890s. Corporate giants emerged, such as Union Oil of California and Standard Oil of California, now known as Chevron. Between 1901 and 1940, California ranked among the first in oil-producing states for 14 years running. Oil refining became the state's manufacturing commodity. Outside of California, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, and Montana joined in this industry, while Texas stole the boom in oil production during the Great Depression, by 1931 replacing California as a top producer. Work life in the American West was diverse. Construction labor, such as for the building of the Transcontinental, was typically held by minorities who were largely unskilled. These included the poor and white, Chinese, former slaves to free blacks. But there were mountain men and miners, mariners and dock workers, merchants and traders, farmers and cattle barons, and a professional class that would include, in some areas, women, such as doctors and teachers. They came west for different reasons and varied by family style. By 1900, city centers such as Denver, Seattle, and El Paso formed a type of urban outpost as compared with little towns across the plains and western frontier, and areas were separated by vast deserts. This included San Francisco from Salt Lake, Los Angeles from Denver. These deserts were hundreds of miles across in places. Forests and mountains, too, stood as significant barriers between urban centers, while most of the state of California was constantly short of water. Advances in technology helped to win the West, in which a new kind of city emerged. It differed from the cities created in the colonial era. Western cities and her residents wanted the home and public comforts found in established cities of the East. We all know this as curb appeal. This encouraged Western cities to become attractive for Easterners to establish their businesses west by doing the following. Consider these points. Number 1, building schools, wharfs, and warehouses. Number 2, commercial centers, public libraries, fire hydrants, and beautiful homes. Number 3, laying streets, telegraph, and later telephone lines. And number 4, installing electric lights, water lines, and making their cities cleaner with sewer lines. What helped the establishment of Western cities was geographical access to it. Railroad, steamship lines, and roads interconnected the West over time, not only for traveler migration, but also for commercial reasons. Transportation networks connected rural farms with commercial centers of trade in cities, large and small. Western cities typically differed and had underlying factors for their creation. Founded 11 years after Salt Lake City, in the early days of the 1870s, Denver existed as a center to outfit miners. The typical Denver migrant was single and male, to which you would expect the town to become a wild town with gold-laden miners looking for a good time with prostitutes, whiskey, gambling, and mayhem. Drunkenness and rioting resulted in a police force, while vigilante activities raged for years. San Francisco was the 19th century city of the West. It had low-density suburbs, cultural centers such as libraries, an opera house, theaters for plays, and existed as a healthy trading commercial center. It was Boston-like as a city type, which was not found elsewhere in the West. San Francisco was considered atypical as a Western city. It contained its share of segregated neighborhoods, such as for the Chinese, Black, Mexican, and Indian. It also had slums, brothels, and saloons. Before gold was found and California became a republic mid-century, San Francisco only had 800 residents. By 1900, it had swelled to 300,000 residents. Yes, San Francisco rose rapidly. 3/4 of the residents of the 1850s were now replaced with immigrants, from moneyed Easterner families to gold miners. White-collar workers, these are professional workers, increased almost 40% between the 1870s and the early 1900s, while San Francisco showed it was not a place in which the unskilled worker would fit in. For the same time, the percentage of jobs for unskilled workers declined by 50%. This occupational shift by the turn of the century was not unique in San Francisco. It was happening across the nation. As the country became more industrial, an educated class was needed, and being white made some Americans more suitable for jobs than others. By the 1880s, forest preserves had been established. Surprisingly, it was not a Western idea, but in upstate New York, to respond to fears regarding deforestation, becoming a model to conservation efforts further west. Federal conservation of forests filtered down to hunting and fishing rights. At the turn of the century, politicians acknowledged new environmental problems. In response, they created new laws to address these issues. To protect migrating birds and the reproductive cycles of some animals, U.S. Congress created the Migratory Bird Act of 1913, followed by the Migratory Bird Treaty with Canada in 1916. Not surprising, local communities argued over traditional times to hunt and where to hunt. As custom, free and unrestricted hunting practices since the frontier times had existed. Fish and game regulation occurred under earlier programs as well. In 1905, the new Bureau of Biological Survey focused on collecting research to identify the impact of wild animals on agricultural crops. Starting in 1915, this committee established a systematic campaign to destroy predators and other creatures considered vermin, to include coyotes, grizzly bears, mountain lions, and wolves, in efforts to protect domesticated cattle. By targeting the wholesale destruction of predatory animals, this had another effect. It made more deer, elk, and moose, highly prized by hunters, more available. To oversee the future of fish, in 1903, the Bureau of Fisheries identified species, their populations, spawning times, and promoted legislation on how they could best protect them in regards to fishing. Separate agencies supervised Alaskan fish and fur seal resources. At the same time, the United States joined Canada, Russia, and Japan in seeking to stop the extinction of Alaskan and Siberian seals, leading to the Fur Seal Treaty of 1911, which banned open sea sealing hunting. Western art illustrates a story commonly remembered by a regional population. Its central character is typically male, either white or Native American. Challenges to his world were typically rivals to his ways and also the environment. Western art confirmed the American spirit of the West, self-sacrificing and pioneering. Western art told cautionary tales about graft and greed, about race and adversity. Progress, there seem to be sacrifices while men make merry over a campfire, and civilization seemed to be out of reach in this Western wilderness of years gone by. As a new genre, artists created a version of the history of the West, a memory not to be forgotten, a romantic view of the West that has disappeared long ago. Even the word Western seems to imply a wild existence against seemingly insurmountable odds. Through legend parlayed as historical fiction, Hollywood filmmakers produce romantic views of a historical past while holding on to the myth and contributing to it. This tradition remains appealing to moviegoers today. The popular legends shown in film could be good history, while the main characters were either real or imagined to help tell the story better than any historian could do. Few average people wrote about their lives in this time, and without primary sources, these histories remain unwritten. Legend and storytelling is the bridge between what is history and what was not written down. Modern moviegoers seem to accept Westerns on face value. For an international audience, this place, known as the West, became larger than life in books, film, and art. Paintings and sculptures from the 1890s illustrated battles and heroes down to their essential elements. It is obvious Western culture was inspired from the ancient Roman and Greek periods. It is an art form celebrating the American West in terms that they can understand. Strong male bodies, conquest, honor, loyalty, and struggle. Common plot lines of life in the Old West, including vigilantes, bandit bad guys, or hired guns for good, and cattle barons along with whites that had gone missing. The Marlboro Man cigarette campaign was established in 1954. The cowboy himself, as a hero, comes under the male escapist fantasy. Western movies produced after World War II to the present typically have common connections. Western films offer, for example, the cavalry as heroic, as they would, once they arrived, would save the day. Meanwhile, the rugged, roguelike main character, strong and independent, though not necessarily handsome, but usually often, would drive the story. Think of John Wayne movies, for example. This character would not give up. He was successful against the bad guys. Of course, he wasn't perfect. He possessed experience, though, and had an excellent feel for common sense and what was right. He was ruggedly handsome. He was a good shot when necessary. This man would be the one to rely on to keep life as it was, unlike relying on completely on the government or local law enforcement. These are some of the features in which filmmakers have remembered the West.